The following program does not necessarily represent the views and opinions of Reality Radio 101, its advertisers and sponsors, or its listening audience. Listener discretion is advised. Good afternoon and welcome to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, where mind, mood, and what matters to you are discussed. We're broadcasting live from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, on Reality Radio 101. To contact us right now, send us an email. Our email address is instudio101@gmail.com. And now, right to your host of the Bear Psychology Radio Show, Dr. Anna Baranowski.
Hi, everyone. I am so glad to be with you again today. Today's topic is one that I find very compelling, and that's spiritual growth as a road to psychological well-being. Now, there's a whole area of transpersonal psychology that looks specifically at spiritual growth and how it can help us in our overall well-being, to understand ourselves better and to recognize that we're probably much bigger, much kind of more profound as human beings than we give ourselves kind of scope to understand in our rational and practical view of the world today. So what I did was I reached out to Steve Taylor, who is a senior lecturer in psychology at Leeds Beckett University and the author of several best-selling books on psychology and spirituality. He's actually the current chair of the Transpersonal Psychology section of the British Psychological Association, and he has published widely in the area books that include experiences from people who have had these remarkably deep, profound awakening experiences. He's looked at, what it means to be a materialist, and I'll explain that a little bit. I'm going to review two of his books. One is The Calm Center, which is actually this really beautiful book that looks at kind of spiritual reflections and meditations. And I'm going to read one of them to you, or maybe two, depending on the time that we have, that kind of help us to understand how deeply we can go in our reflections and what it means to really contemplate who we are, how we're shaped, and our deepest levels of growth. And the other book that I'm going to look at is Spiritual Science. And in Spiritual Science, he does a very deep dive into what happens when we change our focus from a very rational and practical approach to one that includes a broader sense of who we are, what it is that makes us human, and whether our connections with each other, the universe around us and beyond are something that we need to maybe consider. So going into our work today, I want you to feel comfortable to email, ask questions, provide comments, because really what we're doing is we're really looking at, who we are as human beings. I know in my practice, I have heard stories from people for years about their experiences that go beyond kind of the rational day-to-day stuff that we might encounter, like, I don't know, buying our new car, or, looking at, what our next education might be, or the job that we might get, and into something that connects us, makes us feel richer and deeper, gives us an element of how profound life can be. And, I found that in this meditations and reflections book, The Clear Light, um, Steve does a really nice job of addressing how deeply we are connected. And what I want to do today is just start with one of his reflections. And this one is called Making the Human Race Whole. And it's a particularly nice one. Make as many connections as you can so that this broken world can become whole again. It's your responsibility to radiate benevolence to everyone you meet, to be reckless with your friendliness, and to surprise strangers with your openness on behalf of the whole human race. It's your responsibility to turn suspicion to trust, hostility to sympathy, to expose the absurdity of prejudice, to return hatred with implacable goodwill until your enemies have no choice but to love you. On behalf of the whole human race, it's your responsibility to free yourself from bitterness and to harness the healing power of forgiveness, to repair broken connections and reestablish bonds that were broken by resentment years ago on behalf of the whole human race. It's your responsibility to open up channels of empathy through which compassion can flow until there are so many connections across so many different networks that finally, like the cells of a body, billions of human beings will fuse together, sensing their common source and their common core. Then a new identity will emerge and overriding oneness. And the human race will be whole at last. Well, to me, this seems like a beautiful, wishful, hopeful ideal. It's profound when we think that maybe we can come together and have a little bit more peace as human beings, a little bit more understanding towards other people, even if you feel that you've been maybe hurt or misunderstood. And I think it holds out the possibility of forgiveness and kindness in ways that we're probably pretty hungry for during this pandemic and likely beyond. I also want to talk a little bit more in depth about transpersonal psychology and just clarify what that actually means. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to listen to David Lukoff, who is Dr. David Lukoff with a PhD. He's involved in the area of transpersonal psychology and how it fills in a missing piece on psychological care and focus.
And Tony Sudich and a few other people at the time. And it's a branch within psychology. Was originally founded back in 1971 by Abraham Maslow and Tony Sudich and a few other people at the time. And their plan was to develop a fourth force in psychology, with the first force already being psychoanalysis and the second being cognitive behaviorism. And then the third was humanistic psychology, which Abraham Maslow and many of these people were already founders of. But they felt that there were some critical things missing from humanistic psychology, one of which was the acknowledgement of the role of spirituality in people's lives and the import that it has. And probably the core assumption of transpersonal psychology is that people are first and foremost spiritual beings. And of course, they have their other dimensions of being in a body, having an ego. So as a psychology, it also needs to address all of those areas. But in addition, it takes a very serious look at people's spirituality.
So really what they're talking about is this whole idea of transpersonal psychology as a subfield or a school of psychology that integrates the spiritual and the transcendent aspects of human experience with a framework of modern psychology. And it's possible to define it as kind of spiritual psychology. So it's called transpersonal psychology, the transpersonal is defined as experiences in which the sense of identity or our self expands or goes beyond using that word trans, the individual or personal. So it encompasses a wider aspect of humankind, like the life, the psyche, or cosmos. And it's also been defined as developmental beyond the conventional, personal, or individual issues or levels. So, these ideas around transpersonal psychology include a spiritual self-development, a self beyond the ego, like peak experiences. And I think many people have had these kinds of peak experiences, like, you're going for a walk in nature, and all of a sudden you just feel incredibly connected with everything. You feel like, life is beautiful. And, sometimes you could have really actually very tough experiences in life, and yet it can open you up in a way that kind of cracks barriers. So you feel connected with everybody. You feel that even in a terrible and sad moment, something feels beautiful and profound. I think, people find it hard at times to admit having life transforming moments, but these things actually happen, and they can be really surprising because you can kind of shift very quickly from a place where you feel very frightened, concerned, worried, uncertain, even traumatized. And then you slip into this place where you're really deeply connected with the fact that there's more to life, and that there's something at peace, even when you feel you've lost something. It's almost as if traumatic experiences, in much of what I've read from these transpersonal psychologists, is that it's often a tipping point for people connecting with their own spiritual growth. So, I just think it's a very interesting area that doesn't get a lot of airtime. What I want to do is I want to go through emails as we're going through this exercise today of talking about transpersonal psychology. And today it is, hi, this is from Steve. And Steve says, not the Steve Taylor who's written the books, Dr. Anna, what a monologue by you. Excellent and interesting. Thank you so much, Steve. Please, Steve, if you're listening right now, if you have experiences that relate to this topic, could you email them to us? Because I'll be reading throughout this radio show. And if anybody out there has had interesting experiences that they feel fit with this transpersonal, this spiritual psychology, or maybe moments where you've had something really difficult happen, and then you found yourself slipping into a very profound, connected place, or, even if you've had just a life experience where all of a sudden you felt life is really beautiful and big and more than I thought it was. That would be beautiful to hear. And this is from Monique. Monique says, I believe in God, even if folks do not believe in God or something else, it doesn't hurt, right? Talking to our spiritual guides can help a lot in our mental well-being. At least it did for me. Very interesting topic. You know, I think that's actually really interesting. And I just want to comment for a moment on Monique's email. She says, I believe in God, even if folks do not believe in God or something else. So it's interesting because I think that's what a lot of people do. They kind of take one step forward and then one step back when talking about the spiritual growth or transpersonal growth. Monique, if you have experiences that you want to share, please do send those in as well, because we definitely are kind of going to spend as much time as we can thinking about this and kind of looking a little bit more deeply at, you know, what is this spiritual growth, and, you know, how is this affecting us, and in what ways do we really need to contemplate our lives as a whole, you know, and just understand, you know, who are we, and, you know, do our lives go beyond the material? So I want to read from
Dr.
Steve
Anna,
Taylor's.
if I can
Yeah.
interrupt you, I believe Steve is in. We're going to let him in, and I
Okay, great.
believe he's here. So if you're there, Steve, if you can hear us, we're looking forward to you.
Hello.
Hello, Steve. How are you today? This is Steve Taylor, and he's joining us on the show today. So we're really happy because I've already started to reference these two books, Spiritual Science, and I was just about to read a passage from your Origins of Materialism from Spiritual Science, and I've read one of your beautiful poems today. So people are excited to hear what you have to say. I'm going to tell you that what we just read was Making the Human Race Whole, which is just, you know, so beautiful. And it fits so well in to this time where so many people feel broken and stressed and disconnected even. So thank you for sharing that and for sharing the book as well. I want to introduce everybody to Stephen Taylor, the author of over 13 books, and welcome to the show.
You're welcome. Sorry I'm a little late. I got the timings confused because I didn't realize in America you've already changed to summertime, haven't you?
Oh, yeah, we have. Exactly.
Yeah, we haven't changed yet in the UK.
Oh, that's so funny. Okay, well, I'm so glad you're here, and welcome. What I would really love to do is hear a little bit. I talked a bit just a few moments ago about what transpersonal psychology is, and I've read several of these books, The Spiritual Science and The Calm, but also The Leap, which I think people might also be interested in hearing about, particularly with the realization that although in the context of our Western world, we really take a materialism approach, people don't know what that is. And, you know, they don't know how it would fit into you know, transpersonal psychology point of view. And the email that I just wrote, so throughout the show, people are going to be emailing us and asking questions. And the email that I just read before you came on was a writer saying she believes in God, but then kind of taking a step back and saying, yeah, well, I guess people can believe in God, you know, like, you know, it's that one step forward, like, look, I believe there's something more going on. And then one step back almost, is that okay that I believe that something's going on? And I think that's a really common feeling that a lot of people have. So two things. Let's talk about materialism to start with, and where people get into trouble with materialism versus using our spiritual growth as a road to healthy living.
A lot of people, if you are a materialist, you believe that consciousness is produced by the brain, and you believe that when people have spiritual experiences or when they have higher states of consciousness, materialists explain that in terms of aberrational or unusual activity in the brain. So they see spiritual experiences as hallucinations, and they only really believe in physical reality. So things like spirit or the soul or God, they can't be real. They're just hallucinations as well. So it's very difficult to explain spirituality in terms of materialism. It basically doesn't fit into materialism. So you can't really be a materialist at the same time as following a path of spiritual development. So you have to go beyond that into a spiritual vision of the world, where you believe that physical reality is not all that there is. That there is something beyond, not necessarily something separate to the body, but something more subtle than the body, you could say.
I really love your comment. And this comes from spiritual science. The strong sense of individuality creates an uncomfortable sense of isolation and lack, which I think is the root of the impulse to accumulate possessions, wealth, status, and power. As separate entities, we feel incomplete, fragments broken from the whole. And by accumulating wealth or power, we're trying to bolster ourselves, to make ourselves feel stronger and more significant in order to compensate for our sense of lack.
Yeah, I think separateness is is a very common human experience. I think a lot of human beings experience a sense that they are separate beings living within their own personal space with the rest of the world out there on the other side. And I think in a lot of, we experience moments of connection as well when we connect with other people or we connect with nature and so on. But separateness is a bit of an issue for human beings because we have this sense of being apart within our own mental space. And that also means that we have a sense of incompleteness, a sense that something's missing, as if we are fragments who have been broken off from the whole. So that produces a desire to accumulate, to make up for something that's missing.
Yeah, because we're walking around like starving beings, wishing for something to nourish. And, in my practice, Steve, I specialize in trauma and it's an area that we see, a lot of people are feeling this terrible sense of distress, and a lot of the trauma is human based, so it reinforces this idea that it's not even safe to connect with other people, even worsening our ability to feel like, instead of recognizing that we're all connected, we want to further alienate ourselves from others because it feels unsafe. And I want to go back to something you just said. And it's really relating to consciousness and, how consciousness plays into, whether we are like a physical brain or if there's something that goes beyond in terms of the creation of consciousness.
Yeah, well, I don't believe that consciousness is just a product of the brain. I believe that there's something more to it than that. And I believe that, at the most essential level, human beings are deeply interconnected and we share the same essential consciousness. So in my book, Spiritual Science, I use the term fundamental consciousness. And I suggest that there is a kind of all-pervading fundamental consciousness, which is the most essential reality in the universe. And I think in some way, we take our being from this fundamental consciousness. That fundamental consciousness becomes our own individual consciousness. And that's how we connect with one another. That's how we can feel each other's suffering and feel the impulse to alleviate each other's suffering. That's the root of empathy and the root of compassion and altruism, because we are fundamentally interconnected.
Mm-hmm. Throughout the show, I'm going to just refer to some of our listeners who write in throughout. And so I'm going to just read this. It's from Alice, who says, hello, so happy that Steve is on the show with you. I am a big fan of his, love his work. So that's so nice that you're getting that recognition in the show today. I think this whole idea of, the fact that nobody's really been able to pinpoint the, where thoughts come from, or, what this element of consciousness really is, what we tap into as the ongoing kind of download of our inner information. I mean, I just think people don't really understand where consciousness even comes from. And yet it's thought by many to be a function of the actual physical brain. And I think that, it's an idea that's really coming to the forefront now. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there is an assumption that consciousness comes from the brain. A lot of people take that completely for granted. But if you look deeply into it, there is actually a lot of evidence that suggests that it's not as simple as that, that consciousness does not equate strictly or directly to brain activity. For example, there are a lot of situations when people have very little brain activity, very little brain activity, even no brain activity, and yet consciousness seems to continue and even become more intense than normal. For example, there are lots of stories of people in comas where there is very little brain activity, but they become intensely conscious, much more conscious than normal. So, and yeah, that's just one example, but there is actually a lot of evidence that consciousness is not directly related to the brain. It's obviously connected to the brain, but I don't think that consciousness is produced by the brain. The way I see consciousness is that it sort of flows through the brain. The brain's more like a transmitter, like a radio, and it picks up a fundamental consciousness and canalizes that into our own individual being. So the brain does have a role, but it doesn't actually produce consciousness. It's more like a transmitter of consciousness.
So that brings me on to this other kind of interesting story, and you reference it in your book. It's about this artist and retired prof, David Mandel. You know who I'm talking about, right? The fellow.
Oh, yeah.
So David Mandel dreams about the future. I don't think this man is alive anymore at this time, but he had a number of different dreams which he painted, and then he would go to this place where there was a clock that had the date on it. He'd stand beside it. He'd take a picture of himself with the picture in front of the clock. So it was like his way of time stamping it. And in one of the dreams, he dreamt about the Twin Towers coming down in the US in New York City. And he painted it, and he explained that he saw planes going into these large buildings. This was the first dream he had about it, I believe, was exactly 10 years or 11 years prior to the events of 9/11. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, he's one of the most amazing examples of precognition, because his paintings were incredibly accurate, and he actually included written information about the disasters as well. Another one was the a Concorde crash in I can't remember the exact date, 1999, I think. He also predicted the Tokyo gas attack in 2001, I think it was. But there were a lot of sort of world disasters which he predicted in a lot of in a very detailed way. I don't know
if you're familiar with Jung's The Red Book.
Yeah, I've read some of it. Yeah.
Yeah, so you'll know that in the Red Book he also references his precognitions also through dreams. And some of them were waking dreams where he was just kind of walking and contemplating and having these horrifying images of lakes and rivers of blood and horrible things like that, and just trying to make sense of it. He didn't.
Well, I mean, it makes sense to me because there's a lot of there are a lot of theories in physics that suggest that time, the common sense view of time is not the reality. Time seems to be more like space. It's not a straight line. Time seems to be more like space. It's kind of spread out as a whole in front of us. So that makes sense in terms of physics, and also makes sense in terms of many experiences of precognition. I think that state when you're between wakefulness and sleep, or maybe when you are actually asleep, that's when these kind of things come through, because the conscious mind is in abeyance, and we seem to be open to these these unusual states of consciousness where we can gain unusual bits of information about the future.
So that's, that's one of the experiences that a person might have, and yet we've done such a bad job of allowing these elements into our conversations. And I think there's a tremendous amount of discomfort and embarrassment. I mean, I hear about these kinds of stories in my practice all the time, but I focus a lot on trauma, and I notice that with a lot of clients who've had trauma stories, they've also had these kind of cracks in their awareness of what this life is really about. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think trauma is, as you probably know from my research, that trauma, I found in my research that trauma is a very powerful way of breaking down the normal ego so that a new self can come into existence. And in some people, there seems to be a kind of latent higher self, which is ready to emerge. It's waiting for the opportunity to emerge. But it often takes an episode of trauma or turmoil to break down the normal ego, so that so that this higher self can arise, and it can emerge into the space left by the dissolution of the normal ego. And so it's a very powerful experience where people open themselves to a lot of realities, a lot of experiences which are normally hidden from them. The normal ego gives us quite a restricted range of experience. So when we go beyond it, we're suddenly opened up to a lot of information, a lot of experiences, which can be, quite frightening as well.
I'm going to go back to our list of listeners, and Sherry says, hello, sometimes when I do not know who to turn to for advice or consolation, I think she's talking about herself, or maybe she does this with some friends or a spouse, we turn to prayer, God, a spiritual guide, etc. I think that helps the mind and the soul. Maybe that is what we all need at this time. That's such a beautiful comment. Yeah.
And I agree.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes we, as a kind of, in North America, I just think we've lost the connection to this more profound layer of who we are and what we can draw on for solace and for a sense of kind of being bigger than our simple accumulations in life.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of people live on the surface of themselves. I think modern life is so busy and stressful, and there's such a bombardment of stimuli, of noise and movement and activity, that we just end up kind of living quite superficially, and we don't allow ourselves moments of quietness and stillness. I mean, those are the times, in quietness and stillness, those are the times when we really go deeply into ourselves and we discover the depths of our own beings. But when life is so busy and stressful, it's not easy to do that.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting, but I think that we live in a culture that just seems to be so focused on the things that we can do or acquire or distract ourselves with, that harnessing that peace seems remote. And I wonder if you have some ideas for our listeners about ways in which they could allow themselves to be a little bit more open to that, even within a world that might be not so friendly towards those ideas.
Well, I often recommend that people schedule a period of nothingness every week. They give themselves one afternoon or one evening when there is nothing at all, no activity, no meetings, no appointments, and they just schedule a time of being, like an afternoon of being, where they don't watch TV or go on the computer. They can maybe do quiet things like listen to music, maybe go for a walk, but they designate a period of being, because otherwise our lives become full of doing, and we need to open up periods of being in our lives. And another thing is nature. Nature is such a a wonderful way of connecting with ourselves and also connecting with nature itself. So, even without realizing, any period that you spend in nature, whether it's walking in the park or the countryside or by the river, that has a healing effect. That puts you in touch with the quiet depths of your own being. So, I think every day, if possible, people should spend half an hour or an hour quietly walking in nature.
I love that. Yeah, absolutely. But there's another side to that piece, and I'm going to just approach that in just a second. Another one of our listeners Elise has just said, hi, just tuned in. Where is Steve located and where can I purchase his books? And I'm just going to say, Elise, it's really, really easy to find Steve. He's got a website with all sorts of videos, Stephen M. Taylor, TAYLOR.com. And it's also on the link on our website, and the full blog will be available. It'll get posted to the Bear Psychology radio show, which will be on iTunes and other channels as well. So you'll be able to find that. And there's also a link to his website that we will have on our website as well, traumapractice.org. So thank you for joining us. Steve, do you want to say anything about your books or how people can find you?
Not really. No, I mean, I'm located in Manchester, in England. 4 hours, usually 5 hours, but tonight it's 4 hours ahead of you. Yeah, my website is the best place to go. I also have a podcast where I lead meditations and little workshops on presence and acceptance and other spiritual topics. But yeah, you can get access to my podcast through my website too.
Oh, that's wonderful. Sorry, did you say, what is your podcast called?
My podcast is called The Clear Light. The
Clear Light. Okay, yeah. That's beautiful. Yeah, wonderful. Okay, so I guess that will be fairly easy for people to find. Here's a comment from Anna, who is just emailing. I am so honored to be listening to both of you. I got to know Dr. Anna through my professor, Dr. Buckner, who recommended the Trauma Practice book, which I love and use much. That's my book, Stephen. You probably are not familiar with that one. It's approach to addressing trauma work within a triphasic model, and it's got a lot of kind of focus on somatic approaches. And Anna goes on to say, spirituality for me is the solid rock on which my identity lies. I know I am fully known, yet fully loved and cherished. And as such, I am free to be the conduit of this attitude toward others, for I see my spirituality a great equalizer. I see everyone as souls with tremendous worth and dignity, and I try to keep that awareness at the forefront of my interactions in and out of sessions. And Anna, this person who is writing, is also a psychotherapist. This is absolutely beautiful, Anna.
Yeah.
So love to read that. It's a really gorgeous to think of it in the context in which you carry that with inside. Yeah.
Beautiful.
I know. So it's nice to read these emails as we go about, because I can see how important they are. But I want to go back to something you said, and it relates to kind of, what can happen sometimes to people when they do let themselves kind of lean into this quietness. And there's two pieces to this. One is encountering their own spiritual emergence, which can feel terrifying. And I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Dr. Emma Bragdon.
Yeah, I do. I know her. Yeah, I know Emma.
So she's written an excellent book for those people listening called The Call of Spiritual Emergency, From Crisis to Personal Transformation. And in her book, she covers a lot of ground. It's a little older book, but if anybody's finding this topic today of interest, I would really recommend this book. It's really about stories of people who've opened up to the profound depths of their inner awareness. And, it explains the causes, dynamics, and personal benefits of life's transformative events, or these, what she calls spiritual emergencies, which can trigger emotional or psychic reactions ranging from NDEs, which are near-death experiences, ESP visions, profound religious experiences, and many other things. And so the issue that I'm kind of talking about right now is, so let's say somebody does go ahead and they start spending more time and contemplating their lives, and they have one of these spiritual emergencies, and they are kind of all of a sudden something inside of them cracks open, and they're going like, oh my God, who am I? What is this life?
Yeah, it can be quite challenging. I think mainly one of the main challenges is that, as I mentioned earlier, suddenly you're opened up, your consciousness opens up, whereas before it was quite restricted within a small range of awareness. Now your consciousness opens up and becomes much wider. So you take in a lot more information, you become a lot more sensitive, and you feel that you're bombarded with impressions and experiences and information. So it feels a little bit overwhelming. But also within you, because your ego, you've been sort of contained within your own ego, within your own being. Once your ego dissolves away, you face other aspects of your own being as well. You face trauma, maybe that you've repressed, memories that you've repressed, aspects of your own being, energies and potentials within you, which were hidden, beyond the boundaries of your ego. So you get this sort of bombardment of material within you as well. So it can be a little bit overwhelming, but I think it helps a lot when people are supported through this process, and it helps a lot when they are in a context or a culture where they can make sense of their experiences. I think there's a tendency in Western cultures to see these experiences as a kind of psychosis, and that they're kind of pathologized. But maybe if this happened to you in a more spiritual culture, you would realize that you were undergoing some kind of transformation. It wouldn't be pathologized. You would be supported and encouraged. So it would be, it would be easier, in a spiritual context.
How did you arrive, if you don't mind me asking, Steve, how did you arrive at the place where you have such a willingness to kind of discuss these issues and spend your career writing about it and believing in these things, when it's not the typical route for a psychologist?
It was spontaneous. It wasn't something that I consciously enacted. It was a very gradual process. I think I always had a spiritual aspect to my being from a young age. I can remember at the age of 16 having what I would call now spiritual experiences. But at the time, I didn't understand them. I thought there was maybe something wrong with me. I thought it was, a bit crazy.
Because you didn't
It took me quite a long time. Sorry?
No, I was just going to say, because as you had suggested before, you were not in a setting where you naturally got that kind of support. So I just mention it. I just mention it because I don't want anybody who's listening to just assume that if you're not getting support right away for like these experiences you might be having, that there's something wrong with you. Like in our culture in general, there isn't that support. So this talk with you today, Steve, is very, I'm super grateful you're here to speak about it, because I think a lot of people have these experiences. I think these experiences are actually more common, but people don't want to talk about it, and they don't know what to do with it when it surfaces. Because it's frightening, and there isn't necessarily a place to speak about it. So if anybody's having an experience like this, pick up Bragdon's book. It's amazing. But also recognize that there's not something wrong with you if you're not getting support right away. I'm sorry, go ahead, Steve.
I completely agree. I think in some ways it is easier now than it used to be. I mean, when I had my experiences, that's sort of, over 30 years ago now. And I didn't know anything about spirituality then. My parents knew nothing about spirituality. Not many people did know anything about spirituality. But spirituality is much more of a mainstream topic now, and so it's easier to establish a framework to make sense of what's happening to you. You could go on the internet, you could research other people's spiritual experiences, and you could think, I'm not. there's not something wrong with me. I'm having a transformational experience. I'm undergoing a spiritual awakening.
Right.
So once you realize that, there's not something wrong with you, then you accept the process and it becomes much easier.
Nice, nice. I want to read this. This is a really beautiful email. Hi, Anna. What an amazing show topic. I absolutely love. This is from Lisa. I absolutely love what was just said about trauma as a way of breaking down the ego in a way that invites you to access a higher self. That's you, Steve. You came up with a fantastic conceptualization of that. As someone who has experienced trauma, I think after hearing this, because what has happened to me has been so unbelievable in a sense, I have this belief that there are things possible that an ordinary person might not imagine. I feel this has opened me up to more than I would have been open to without a trauma. Being hypervigilant also makes me very open to things others might not see or be aware of. I am now seeing this as a gift. I haven't had experiences of knowing something was going to happen just by feeling. I get that that is absolutely distinct to these experiences. I do not know what that thing might be, but it is mostly something quite enormous. My father passed away a year ago. Almost each time I go to the cemetery, I either see a red-tailed hawk or find a white feather close to his grave, which is in a very isolated area. These moments are significant to me. Nature for me is not only spirituality in a sense, but also somehow gives me hope and a deep sense of love. Being in nature is one of the only places where I feel I truly belong fully.
Wow, that's beautiful.
It is beautiful. Yeah, exactly. And so, this is the kind of stuff that I think is really, it's so profound, because it's interesting how common these experiences really are, that people don't have to feel that they're alone in these profound moments. I mean, I'm not saying that, everything is, our spiritual unfolding. Some things are just, coincidence, but there are some things that go beyond coincidence. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit about that. You address it beautifully in your book, and you handle a complex topic with a lot of kind of willingness to pull it apart bit by bit.
Yeah, we have to remember that normal human awareness is quite limited. I mean, every animal, we are just animals after all, we're similar to other animals in many respects, but every animal has a certain awareness of reality. And we have a certain awareness of reality, but it's limited in the same way that every animal's awareness of reality is limited. So there are certain things, there are certain phenomena which are normally beyond our awareness. But there are certain moments when our awareness expands or intensifies. And in those moments, we sense things that are not normally part of our experience. We sense synchronicities, we sense information from the future. We maybe receive communication from people who are deceased. So I think, there's so much out there which we are not normally aware of. And I think there's a tendency for a lot of people to circumscribe their reality. This is reality. The reality we see in everyday life through our normal awareness is all there is. But that's not true. There's so much more out there. And, that's one of the reasons why life is so fascinating, because we can explore these wider ranges of reality.
Absolutely. Now that brings me to another issue. So yes, we can look at all of these really interesting things, and we can recognize that we're connected in more ways than we want to give space for in our Western culture. But there's also the risk of, this term of spiritual bypassing, which is really, using this place of holding peace and, not showing anger and, not allowing ourselves to be separate or see people as separate. And it doesn't allow us to really have an honest emotional base. What are your thoughts about spiritual bypassing?
That occurs when the ego kind of hijacks spirituality, and it becomes when spirituality is used as a tool to defend the ego, to defend us from reality. And it's easily done. I think one of one of the most extreme ways in which people can use spiritual bypassing is by denying that the world actually exists. You know, some people believe that the world is a kind of illusion, and so that everything that happens to you is not really real. You don't really need to feel responsibility for the world or to worry about anything because it's all illusory. That's, you know, that's quite an extreme form of bypassing. Or maybe, you know, you might believe that that you are an illusion, that the self is an illusion, which is another way of bypassing all your problems. Because if you're not real, your problems aren't real, and you don't need to do anything about them. I mean, so that's true in some cases. Some problems are created by the mind, but you know, most of us have issues we need to deal with, aspects of our own being we need to develop, and so on. So yeah, spiritual bypassing is quite common, but you know, it's like I say, I think it's really a consequence of the ego getting involved in spirituality.
Interesting. Um, and I know that you've covered even more controversial issues in spiritual science, including NDEs, which are near death experiences. And there's so much pushback with NDEs, and the burden of proof is so high. I wonder kind of what you've learned about NDEs and how you've made sense of them.
That's such a common experience. I've met so many people, you know, without even attempting to research the topic. I've met so many people in the midst of my life who've had these experiences, and everybody knows that they're really common. And there are so many attempts to explain them in biological or physiological terms, you know, in terms of a lack of oxygen to the brain or psychedelic chemicals that are released in the brain when we're close to death. But, you know, I've done a lot of research into the topic, and none of these theories are satisfactory in any way. They're all severely deficient. And there are probably like 15 or 20 different theories. And in a sense, in itself, that shows you that you know, there are real problems with explaining these experiences in biological terms when there are so many different theories. So these experiences really point to a different model of reality. They point to a model of reality where consciousness is not just produced by the brain. And so consciousness can continue, at least for some time, when the brain is inactive or when the brain is effectively dead. So that points to the kind of thing I was talking about earlier, where consciousness is something fundamental rather than something that's just produced by the brain.
Yeah, and that is actually really a very, I keep going back to consciousness because I find that such an interesting topic. And I'm going to reference spiritual science again. In here, you're referencing David Chalmers. And Chalmers sees some aspects of the relationship between cognitive activity in the brain that psychologists and neuroscientists understand fairly well. And you go on and say, for example, we have a fairly good idea of the brain functions involved in memory, attention, and information processing, but these are just, in Chalmers' terminology, the easy problems. The problem of how the brain might give rise to consciousness is on a completely different scale. That's called the hard problem, and may not be soluble at all because we don't have the tools to measure it or get access to what is being tapped into. And I think NDE is one of those complications. And, you know, of course, if you want to believe that the brain produces everything, then, you know, NDEs is not an option. You cannot leave room for that because it's too uncomfortable to contemplate what that might be.
No. I mean, whatever you think about NDEs, that they point to, you know, a world which is much stranger and much more complex than materialism, you know, than everyday reality. There is much more to reality than we can sense. And so, you know, some people believe that NDEs suggest that there is an afterlife. And, you know, I'm, you know, even though I'm an academic and a scientist, I think there's a lot of evidence pointing to some form of an afterlife. But certainly, you know, in the mildest possible interpretation, NDE suggests that the world is an incredibly strange and complex place that we don't really understand at all.
So then how do you help people come to terms with with that strangeness, because I agree. I see the world as a pretty strange place, and I mean, I think particularly because of the work that I do, focus so much on trauma, I have to have a open mind to the strangeness. Otherwise, everything would seem just way, way too tragic. And that's not to say that I don't have great compassion for the people that I work with and the suffering that they experience. But I also have a very broad mind to this strangeness you're referring to. So, can you just say a little bit more about the strangeness and how you help people kind of come to terms with that?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's quite comforting to believe that the world is understandable, and it's quite, it gives you a sense of control over the world. I think that's why a lot of people like materialism, because they feel like, oh, yeah, we understand the way the world works. We have a basic picture of reality. We know pretty much everything. And it gives you, a sense of control, sense of power, even a sense of identity. So to realize that there is much more to reality, and what we perceive is only a fragment of reality, that can be quite destabilizing. But I think actually, in my experience, most people love it. They love to think that, wow, there is all this strangeness out there. The world is not a comprehensible, restricted black and white place. It's full of strange phenomena. So I think it's a question of trust. It's a question of acclimatizing to the strangeness. Once you start to live in a wider reality, it may be difficult in the beginning because you feel a bit exposed, a bit overwhelmed, maybe. But, very quickly you begin to acclimatize, just as if you move to a different country where there are wide expanses and you have to get used to the space. And, so, yeah, I think in my experience, people actually really relish living in this strange world.
It certainly gives a little bit more space for all the unfortunate things that happen, or the really mind opening things that can occur. And, trying to explain it with, very rational means can be very limiting, and,
Yeah.
leave a person with a hard containment. Like it's hard to contain some of the difficulties that people are
Yeah,
expressing.
it's a little bit like when 500 years ago in Europe there was a religious worldview, and the world was explained in terms of the Bible, and then science began to emerge, and there were lots of new findings which didn't make sense, and so people tried to repress them or try to make sense of them. They tried to quiet and silence scientists. So I think it's quite similar now. It's become evident that the materialist worldview cannot really explain the world. There are lots of findings which don't make sense in terms of materialism. So there's obviously resistance to these new findings, but you can't stop it. It's emerging, and it will continue to emerge.
And I guess that's really the beautiful thing. I think that you offer courses as well. Before we finish, can you talk a little bit about your meditations and your courses, and what you're offering for people who are interested?
Yeah, I offer an online course which is available on my website, and it's a 5-week video course. Well, basically, I take people through a journey of spiritual awakening. It's based on my research into spiritual awakening. Particularly, I found that spiritual awakening quite commonly occurs following periods of trauma and turmoil. And there are certain stages that people go through, and certain characteristics of spiritual awakening which people develop. So I try to cultivate those characteristics. For example, a sense of gratitude, a sense of acceptance and presence, and so forth. We cultivate these characteristics on the online course.
Hmm. And you're doing some meditations as well. Can you talk a little bit about how you formulate those, and maybe give us a little snippet of what you would focus on?
Yeah. Well, one meditation I've recently put out on my podcast, I call it podcast, is it's based on oneness with the body. And I wanted to focus on that because some spiritual teachers and spiritual traditions have a tendency to have a dualistic view of the body. They see the body as something separate to the spirit, even something that's kind of base and animalistic that we should try to rise above. So in my meditation, I try to develop a sense of integration and oneness with the body. So it basically consists of bringing awareness to different parts of the body. And also when we all go through periods when our minds become very busy and full of chattering thoughts. So when your mind is full of chattering thoughts, bring your attention down into your body, slowly through different parts of your body. And as you bring your attention down into your body, your mind slowly quietens down. So as your breathing slows, your mind begins to slow down. And eventually you develop a sense of being rooted down into your body. And you have a sense that your mind is one with your body. And then when your mind is beyond the body, then you can maybe even get a sense that both mind and body are filled with a spiritual essence, or they derive from a spiritual source. So I try to take people to that spiritual source during the meditation.
Beautiful. So for people who are interested in Steve's work, it's stephenmtaylor.com. He's got more than 13 books that are available. I want to thank you so much, Steve, for coming on with us and sharing your beautiful work. And for people who are interested, I have to say, the clear light, I've been actually in the mornings when my husband and I are sitting at the breakfast table together, which is not that common, probably no more than once or twice a week at the very most, because we work on different shifts. We've been reading through the clear light, and I have to say there are some really beautiful and thought-provoking and heart-opening reflections and meditations in this book. So I want to thank you for that as well, Steve. I hope I'll get a chance again to speak with you. People were very excited about what you had to say today. And I wish everybody a gentle day and enjoy your spring. And thank you again, Steve, for joining us.
Thanks, Anna. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And the podcast will be available, so I will send that to you and make it available for anybody who wants to share it. Be well, everybody, and see you next month again. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, right here on Reality Radio 101.